I've been involved with jumping worms about 5 years now in Illinois, and it's been an interesting kind of path and discovery of really going from not knowing anything about them in the whole state to discovering a lot. And actually now we've got several graduate students at the university working on them and really kind of building some knowledge up over the last few years. So I'm kind of take you through what we know and what we understand about jumping worms, um, why we're concerned about them, and kind of what we can do about them. So let's take off here. So jumping worms are one of the many what we consider invasive species here in Illinois. And so I always like to start any talk that I'm doing about invasive species with some basic definition so that you know what I'm talking about. We're on the same page in terms of what an invasive species is. And so when I say an invasive species, I'm talking about a species that's not native to that ecosystem. It's not a natural part of that ecosystem. It wasn't, didn't naturally migrate there on its own means, or it did not evolve there. It was native to somewhere else, and it has been introduced by humans one way or the other. And then that species has escaped and naturalized and formed free living populations. And then those populations that are now out in the wild have some ability to disrupt the native or natural functioning of those ecosystems. And so that disruption, that change, it could be a negative change. We consider that damage. And so those disruptions or impacts to our native communities, our native ecology, we call that damage. It could be ecological damage, environmental damage. There's some kind of negative consequence of that new species now being on the landscape. And invasive species can really be across the board in terms of taxa. We have everything from invasive diseases that impact animals, like white nose syndrome on bats, invasive diseases that impact plants, like thousand canker disease, plenty of invasive plants, invasive insects, and vertebrates as well. And yes, we do have feral hogs in Illinois. They really run the gamut. If you can tell just by listening to me, I'm not a native Illinoisan. I grew up in the South, and so this was the poster child for us for invasive species, the one that we kind of all intuitively knew when you try to describe an invasive, and it was kudzu, right? I mean, that was they call it the vine that ate the South. That was the one that everybody kind of knew when you talked about invasive. In Illinois right now, I would say that poster child for the general public is the silver carp, right? Everybody's watched those YouTube videos of people trying to jet ski or water ski up the Illinois River and getting hit by jumping carp. So I think the public in general kind of understand invasive species through some of these sexier invasives, if you will. But over the last few years, jumping worms have started making it into the news more and more, not just in Illinois, but other states. Here's just a couple examples from just this past year. One from Minnesota. The one on the right there was an article from, I think, the New York Times about jumping worms. So it's really, really being noticed now as an issue. It's getting more press. I think I did 5 or 6 or 7 different radio interviews and one TV interview last year just on jumping worms. And it's getting more interest in the scientific world too, in terms of investigating jumping worms and especially investigating their impacts. This is a Science Daily report from some research from the University of Wisconsin and in partnership with the University of Illinois about some interesting changes to the soil from invasive species. And then just finally, this is an article that came out in the Chicago Tribune 2 years ago now that they interviewed me. And that was the article that we got a lot of press, right? For Illinois, we got a ton of radio requests and TV requests and and everything. So it's becoming more and more on people's radar screen. So that's why I'm really happy to talk to you all about it. So what I'm wanting to do for this presentation really is just to provide an update on jumping worms in Illinois. Kind of what is the current status? What do we know about jumping worms in terms of where they are, where they invade, those things in Illinois. I'll discuss some recent research on the impacts of jumping worms, and then hopefully just equip everyone with knowledge necessary to recognize jumping worms, report populations if you're in an area where we don't know there's jumping worms, or just take the steps necessary to not spread these species around. So hopefully that's what you're looking for. I'm very excited about answering questions at the end of this and really discussing these things with you all. But let's start all the way back when we talk about jumping worms, back to the glaciers. And when I was in college, I had a geology class, and all the students had a joke that in any test, if you didn't know the answer, you would just say, well, a glacier did it, and your chances of being right were pretty high. And so that's why I go all the way back when we're talking about worms in Illinois, the glaciers did it. And so as I'm sure you're familiar, we've had multiple glaciation periods in Illinois, the most recent being the Wisconsin era there. And it ended about 12,000 years ago when it started receding out of Illinois. And this had big impacts on Illinois in general, but especially on the earthworms here in the state. And basically, as the glaciers covered the state, they eradicated, if you will, or extirpated earthworms from the landscape. After the glaciers receded, earthworms are not a fast species, so they did not recolonize Illinois naturally very quickly. And so because of that, we really do not have a lot of natural native earthworms in our state. And so there's just was not a lot of recolonization, even though we do have some. It's really, as a group, a very, very non-diverse group in Illinois. In fact, there's only about 38 species known from Illinois of earthworms, and that's in just 6 different families. And so compare that to, say, the plants in Illinois. We have 3,000 or more plants in Illinois, 400 or 500 bird species. We have 400 or so butterfly species and moths, thousands of beetles, hundreds of mammals. So we only have 38 species of earthworm in Illinois. But if you dig a little deeper, about 20 of those species are actually introduced exotic species. So really, we have about 18 species of earthworm in Illinois that are considered native in Illinois. So very, very non-diverse. Naturally not, the natives anyway, naturally not very widespread and common. The vast majority of the time when you see an earthworm, it's actually a non-native earthworm. But earthworms in general, they are an eating machine, as it says here, and they eat dirt. So earthworms typically feed on detritus, on litter, or decaying organic matter. They eat the organic matter either from the thatch, the leaves, the litter from plants, or they actually eat part of the dirt and actually consume the organic matter out of the dirt. So that's what they feed on, and that's just basically their life is eating. But earthworms are a little different in terms of the different species, and there's 3 kind of functional groups that you can split earthworms into. So there's the litter dwellers, and those will mainly stay in the actual leaf litter and not get into the mineral soil that often. They really prefer the actual organic litter. Then there's the topsoil dwellers that usually confine themselves to that high organic matter, first few inches of actual soil. And then there's those that can go into the subsoil or dig deeper down. These are all 3 different kind of strategies or functional groups of earthworms. In general, jumping worms fall into those first 2 groups, and we'll talk about that here in a bit. But they tend to restrict themselves, except for certain circumstances, in the leaf litter, the thatch, the organic matter on top of the soil, or in that immediate topsoil. That is where they tend to do most of their feeding, spend most of their time when it's hospitable for them. And so in terms of impacts, the impacts of jumping worms are concentrated in that area, and that really influences kind of how they impact the ecology of an area. Jumping worms are non-native. They are from Asia, Eastern Asia primarily, and we do associate them with some big ecosystem impacts, primarily with changes to soil properties. They're found in several areas of the United States. I'll show a map here in a second. And we've had a lot of increasing reports in Illinois, and we'll end with some talk about where they are in Illinois, but just know that they're across Illinois. In terms of taxonomy, when we first started this back in 2015 here in Illinois, it was kind of understood by a lot of people that jumping worm was one species, the Amethys agrestis species. Now that we've had more chances to look at it, doing some DNA work, and we actually have some taxonomic expertise looking at these earthworms, we now understand that it's actually a complex of mostly 3 different species that are closely related. There are 2 species in the Amethys group and 1 species in the Metaphyre genus. They look very similar. They're very, very difficult to tell apart. So we generally lump them together and consider that a complex and call that complex itself jumping worms. A lot of times you'll find 1 or more of these species together anyway in the environment. And so jumping worms, that's the common name now that we call this complex, this Amethys Metaphyre complex. There's been a lot of other names that go by. You may have heard snake worms. For a while, they were called crazy worms, particularly in the fish bait community. They're called Alabama jumpers. They call them something different in vermiculture community. They may call them the jumpers there too, or Alabama worms. So they go by a bunch of different names. The typical name that we call them would be jumping worms. And they're across, like I said, across the US. These are states that I could find confirmed populations of jumping worms in. So very widespread in the eastern United States, and then poking its head out west there in Oregon. And a lot of these states are taking jumping worms seriously. If you get online and find out and see, you'll see pages and information and educational materials from a lot of different states about jumping worms. Everywhere from Minnesota here. Wisconsin has a lot of information about it. They're probably the leader in the Midwest in terms of dealing with jumping worms. Even the Smoky Mountains, they're dealing with jumping worms there, doing a lot of research. There's a whole Great Lakes Worm Watch, which looks at all the different exotic worms, including jumping worms here. So that covers a lot of those Midwestern states. In New England, Vermont, and some of the other states in New England are really dealing with this as well. And then here in Illinois, we do deal with jumping worms. This is a one of our publications we put out and we revised just last year on jumping worms, and this can be found on the University of Illinois Extension page. But again, there's a lot of places are out there educating people and looking at and being concerned about this invasive species. So how do you identify jumping worms? So they are a big worm. They can get large. I know it says up to 8 inches there. I've actually seen jumping worms up to 12 inches long. So they're one of the biggest worms that you'll find in Illinois. In general, their back is a little darker than their belly, which if you can figure out the back versus a belly on a worm, you're doing really good. The skin is pretty glossy, almost has like a sheen to it, almost a rainbow looking sheen to that. It's a rigid, stiff worm, so it almost feels like a snake a lot of times when it's in your hand versus a worm that's soft and squishy. And they're very active. They thrash wildly often when they're picked up. Many times they thrash around so crazily, so wildly, that they'll actually break themselves in half and shed their tail that way. And when they're on the ground moving and they're trying to go somewhere, they move more like a snake in terms of undulating back and forth, left and right, than a lot of the other worms, which kind of scrunch and stretch and scrunch and stretch. So they look a lot different. And a lot of people, when they see these, they first thing they think of is a little decay snake or a little earth snake or one of the smaller snake species we have, because it acts like that and it's roughly that size. So I have a video and I'm hoping it's gonna play. So let's see if this works. So hopefully you can see this bowl of jumping worms and how they kind of move back and forth and undulate more like a snake. When they're disturbed, they do flip and wiggle crazily, actually. You see some jumping out there. Alrighty. So, yeah, so that's kind of how they act. When you really want to get a close look at them, the identification is all about the clitellum on a worm. And so a clitellum is that band that goes around the worm. Most worms have that. It varies in size, in color, in position. So in jumping worms, oftentimes that, at least we used to say that clitellum was a milky white color. And the more I look at that, the more variable that is. So I'm not sure that the color on that is consistent enough to really have it as an identification feature. It often is milky white, but it's been all the way from that to dark brown. But that clitellum, that band, is smooth in terms of it's about the same diameter as the worm itself. A lot of other worms, that clitellum is going to be raised or bigger and thicker than the rest of the worm. This one, it's roughly the same size, so it's not raised. And importantly, it fully encircles the body. So if you flip that worm over and look at the underside of the worm, that clitellum is going to look the same. It's going to be a band that goes all the way around. If you look at, say, night crawlers and flip them over, that band is going to have an interruption. It's going to be broken at the bottom of it, and it won't go all the way around the worm. And it'll be wider and a little thicker than the rest of the worm. And the other thing is it starts on the worm at about the 14th segment back from the head or from the front of the worm. And that's a lot closer up than the other big worms we have, like night crawlers, Lumbricus terrestris. They typically start much farther back. So there's a lot more worm in front of the clitellum on the night crawlers and some of the other bigger worms than there are in jumping worms. So this is actually a picture of the first verified jumping worm that we found in 2015 in Illinois. And we've, again, found a bunch more, but you can see it kind of checks off all those features. A big, heavy worm, very round, stiff, shiny, that smooth clitellum starts close up to the front. And we've had lots of other reports and submissions of it. So we get to see these over and over again. And once you see enough of them, you start to recognize, and they're actually fairly easy to identify. And to me, the biggest things are that clitellum, that's the same diameter and also starts that close to the front of the worm. So like I said, it starts somewhere around the 14th segment. So if you look here, I've drawn and outlined the different segments on this worm. And you can see, count back all the way to 13. So right about the 14th segment is where that clitellum starts. Now, in terms of just seeing the conditions or seeing evidence of jumping worms on the ground, the big thing that you look for is this unique soil signature. So these worms, like I said, focus their feeding and their time they spend in the soil in those top 2 to 4 inches of soil in the leaf litter. And they can live at high population densities. And so through their worm castings and their feeding They tend to actually change the aggregate size in the soil and change the conditions of the soil. And it creates this coffee ground looking conditions in the soil where they have these large aggregates kind of rounded, and it does kind of look like coffee grounds. And if you see that in a soil, it's a good indication that you may have some jumping worms there. What I've seen across the state is this happens more frequently in higher organic matter soils, better soils. If you get into soils where there's a lot of clay content, lower productivity soils, heavier clay soils, it does not tend to form this same soil signature. So it's a bit variable depending on your soil type. Heavy clay soils, this is not a feature you'll see a lot, but those better, more richer soils, this often shows up. And again, it's that coffee ground look. And you can see here just on this flower bed, the coffee grounds there. Usually the worms have to be there for a year or so. The population has to build up to really see this. But once it's there in those higher quality soils, this often happens. And just as an example, or just as a comparison, so here's a night crawler, the other big worm we have here. You can see its clitellum is raised, and it starts farther back. If you wanted to count those segments, it's going to be at 22 or 24. So usually it starts beyond segment 20. And then just a comparison of the two. So we have a night crawler, a lumbricus on the left, jumping worm on the right, and you can see how much farther back that clitellum starts on the night crawlers. And you can tell that that worm looks a little flattened, softer. It's not as rigid as the jumping worms. So in terms of the biology or the ecology of jumping worms, as I mentioned before, these live primarily in that upper layer of soil and leaf litter. They feed on leaf litter, they feed on the detritus. Although they will go deeper in, and we'll talk about that here in a minute, especially in droughty conditions. They are parthenogenic, so they can reproduce without mating. They don't need two worms. One worm can reproduce by itself. The adults die in very cold conditions, and so in the northern parts of the state, these worms act more like an annual animal, in the sense that they overwinter through these microscopic cocoons. The cocoons will hatch, and the new worms will grow early in the year, and then the adult population will die off in the winter, before winter. And so that's how they work in the northern part of the state. What we're finding in the southern part of the state is that they typically are able to overwinter as adults, depending on how cold it gets. So it's a little different down here than it is up there. They reach maturity in about half the time as the European earthworms do. So they have the potential to have 2 hatches per season. And that just helps them create these densities of 10 times the amount of other worm species, again, concentrated in the top soil layer. Usually you're going to see them when they start really maturing and you get those large worms. So oftentimes you'll see them on the ground, or see them easiest kind of late summer to early fall. That's really when they're most visible on the landscape, particularly in the northern part of the state where they don't overwinter as adults. Some research out there found that hatchlings were first observed when air temperatures reach about 50 degrees. Die-offs start being observed when temperatures fall below 41 degrees. That's a bit variable there, but it's really the soil temperature. They mature in as little as 77 days. The cocoons have been shown to overwinter in soil temperatures down to negative 20 degrees. So even this cold weather we've had is not going to necessarily kill them out of the soil. They do tend to avoid dry soil conditions or move when the conditions are dry. And we've seen that here where soil moisture is abundant. You'll have worms everywhere. All you have to do is scrape the soil a little bit and the jumping worms will jump everywhere. But when that soil starts to dry, they'll move a little deeper to get away from those dry conditions and you can't find them. Their density, their growth rate tends to be highest in those moist soils or very rich soils. In terms of impacts, what do they do? There's been some interesting research over the last few years, and particularly on impacting the soil. And so Key and Turner in 2016 found that the leaf litter mass, so the leaf litter, the foliage, the thatch on the soil surface, that jumping worms led to an 84 to 95% decline in that leaf litter. They were simply breaking it down, eating that material that fast. And that led to, in a matter of just 80 days, a 24% decrease in the forest floor mass. And that's basically just eating through that organic matter, accelerating that decomposition. And that's kind of an interesting impact because we like worms. We talk about the need for worms. We like them because they decompose things. They break organic matter down and make it more available, and they do that. The problem with jumping worms is at the speed of which they do that. So they rapidly transform this organic matter into mobile forms. Those mobile forms are available for plant uptake. You can get plant growth right there, but it's also so mobile that it'll actually be eroded out or leached out of the soil very quickly. And so what you get is this big pulse of nutrient availability as the worms eat and work through that organic matter. And then that availability is gone, right? So that we all know that that organic matter, that leaf litter, all that is basically at the bank for nutrients, and it typically breaks down much more slowly. That slow breakdown of organic matter is kind of a slow release of nutrients, and it allows the plants to utilize it. If it breaks down very, very quickly, you get a pulse of that nutrient availability, but then you lose that bank, and so you have periods of kind of a paucity of organic matter for the plants to be able to grow. You also get an overall decrease in soil carbon. At the same time, you get an increase in that aggregate size of soil. So think of those coffee grounds, and that leads to the soil not being able to hold as much water. The water moves through its bigger pore space, so the soil becomes a little more drought sensitive. So just some shots there, you can really see that that soil size there, that aggregate size, that coffee grounds. And this is a report from north central Illinois, which was one of the worst lawns, anyway, that I've seen impacted by it. And here's a couple pictures of the people's lawn that sent me this, just huge dead patches where really no plants were able to grow. And this was all, if you get down and looked at it, it was all that coffee ground look and just loaded with jumping worms. We've had some recent research here at the university just in the last year or two, and they found that the jumping worms actually increase the metabolic rate of organisms in the soil, which can release more carbon dioxide. It releases that carbon and nitrogen from soil storage. Like I said earlier, it depletes that long-term stores of it, and that can lead to a change in the soil, bacteria, the fungi, and chemistry and pH are impacted. So there's a lot of impacts in terms of soil. And that's where a lot of the research has been done. In terms of wildlife, there's been a few research projects, and these were primarily done in the Smoky Mountains. But they found that the worms eating through this organic matter and this thatch and detritus on the forest floor really impacted forest-dwelling organisms like salamanders. Basically, they had to move a lot more to try to find cover because their cover kept getting eaten. And that could impact their survivability, their ability to mate or rear young. And I like the quote there, by the third week of the experiment, the earthworms had broken down so much of the leaf litter in these microcosms that there was only really just wood left for the salamanders to get under. All the leaves and things that they normally live under were already eaten through. And it's kind of the same thing for millipedes that use that soil layer, that they found drops in millipede richness and abundance due to these jumping worms. In terms of plants, there hasn't been as much research. There's been a lot of research on the European earthworms, but not as much on these jumping worms. We feel that what we've seen anecdotally and observationally is a reduction in herbaceous plant cover. Tend to be a strong association with invasion by non-native invasive plants. And just talking with landowners that are dealing with these jumping worms, some quotes from them: large patches of grass started dying, ornamental plants are struggling, bare ground visible, and even some small shrubs actually tipping over. So they're talking about big changes, and this was more in a residential setting. We had a little bit of research on tree seedlings coming out of the university with the grad work of Tricia Bethke. She found that seedling growth of buckthorn and sugar maple actually increased with jumping worms, but white oaks decreased quite a bit significantly, the growth of these seedlings when they were trying to be grown in the presence of jumping worms. So the impacts vary a little bit, but it does seem to kind of go along with at least buckthorn. And this is a look at European earthworms. This is a slide about European earthworms, but the same kind of holds true for jumping worms, where if it eats through that top layers of soil, you get subsidence, roots are exposed, more soil compaction, and then there's a harder time for plants to grow in these forested environments. And so you'll see kind of dead patches in the forest, like this, or like this. It's the worm front, as they call it, which I think is a funny name. But these species are spread around through those microscopic cocoons. And so that's the issue, is that you can't often even see if you're spreading these around or not, because it's not just the adult worms, it's the cocoons that you can't see. So anything that really moves soil or anything that the worms can get into has a risk of spreading these species around. So mulch, compost, soil, plants, particularly plants that are grown in the ground and not grown in pots, baits, vermiculture, all of these have the ability to spread jumping worms around. You can even buy them online like you can anything. So here you can buy 1,000 Alabama jumpers for just $65, the low, low price. So again, they're spread a lot of different ways. The kind of bad news of this whole talk is that there's not a lot you can do once you have them in terms of getting rid of them. We don't have any approved effective control mechanisms or methods currently, although there is some research out there looking at saponids, kind of organic lawn fertilizers, that they seem to work fairly well as a worm control, but we haven't, the research hasn't been done enough to be able to label that for use on worms, but it does seem promising. So hopefully in the next few years, we will have some options people can use to get rid of the worms. There has been some research looking at prescribed fire in a forest may kill some of those cocoons, or especially the juveniles, especially spring fires. So there may be some benefit to on jumping worms for prescribed fire. And of course, we all know that there's a lot of benefits to prescribed fire in a forest to our native species. So that's promising. But usually what we recommend people do is focus on spread prevention. So if you have it, not moving those things around, because once they're in a new place, they're very, very difficult to get rid of. And so that's things like clean soil, clean debris, garden tools, anything that you're working in an area that has jumping worms if you move to a new area, look for them, find them. Don't sell plants from areas that have jumping worms. Don't trade compost or mulch around unless it was heated to appropriate temperatures or gone through the process that way to kill the jumping worms. And the basic kind of heat treatments should work on that. But, just being wise and not spreading these things around. In terms of the history, they were first found in Wisconsin in 2013. That was kind of the first recognized population in the Midwest. You can see here that they've spread throughout much of southern Wisconsin since then. In Illinois, we've had 3 historic records of Amythus species. But it's important to note that these are not the species that are considered jumping worms. They're just closely related. 2 of those historic records were only found in greenhouses. And the third one, I found one reference that it was well established in the Champaign-Urbana era, and this was an older reference. But this is good to recognize that this is not the species that we consider jumping worms. So we started finding out about jumping worms once Wisconsin had it in 2013. We were worried about getting it in Illinois, so we developed a jumping worm task force, and basically it was a compilation or a group of agencies and organizations that deal with invasive species to kind of figure out what to do and address the issue of jumping worms. And so we developed what we call now the old county confirmation system, where we wanted live or specimens, not live necessarily, but actual physical specimens from each county record and submitted to us. And then we would use all this information to correctly verify it. And that worked really well until we realized that we had much more than we thought. So this was kind of an intensive way of finding new county confirmations. That's the way we did it for years. Including with that was you had to collect the specimens, put them in a container, either that or preserve them in alcohol, and then send them to the plant clinic. That was kind of how we started. And in 2015, we got our first reports from northeastern Illinois. By 2018, we realized we had a lot of reports, and we had a lot of people were submitting pictures at this point in time, but not necessarily getting the live specimens. And then it just keep growing. And so by 2020 now, this is what it looks like. And we're sure it's much more widespread, but this is kind of the state of jumping worms that as we know it in Illinois right now. Very widespread in the northern part of the state, very widespread in the southern part of the state, with a big block in the central part of the state and growing. I don't doubt if we get more people looking for this and reporting it, that it's going to be widespread across the state. Currently, we have 63 reports. 40 of those are confirmed with pictures, pictures good enough to confirm the species ID or specimens. 23 are unconfirmed, so they were either like verbal descriptions or pictures that weren't clear enough to identify it with. 22 confirmed counties. We have 5 suspect counties, which we did not have good enough pictures to verify. And that goes from 2015, we had 7 reports in 3 counties. Now we're up to 63 reports. But this is even still underreporting because we had so many reports from those northeastern Illinois counties that we actually stopped tracking additional reports. Just because we had so many from them, we consider those 3 or 4 or 5 counties in far northeastern Illinois generally infested because we had so many reports that it didn't even make sense to continue tracking them. Because we've got better at identifying these things by picture and we've gotten better at understanding where they're at, we have a new county confirmation system where as long as we can have quality images or quality videos, we can verify it with that. And then I'm the primary verifier. I'll have my email at the end. So new reports in new areas, definitely send it to me with quality pictures. So we would need pictures like this that we can easily see the clitellum, its color, its size. We can see its location and be able to count the segments. Those are the kind of pictures that allow us to correctly identify this to that, that general jumping worm group. And so I'll end here just talking about just showing you some of the pictures that we've got of reports. Here's one from Cook County, Sangamon and Will County, different reports sent to us. Here's a video from Lake County. Hopefully I can get it to play that they sent us. You can see the worms snaking through there. Just a short little video. And then our current champion in terms of size was this 12-incher from Pope County, way down in southern Illinois. So yeah, that's what we're looking for, reporting these species. If you know you have them, not moving or not spreading them around. So in summary, this is actually a complex of several species. They're widely established in the US and we're finding them throughout Illinois. We're recognizing now that they have some big impacts to soil structure, soil fertility, and that could impact wildlife, plant growth. We're finding more and more out now just how big those impacts are. And we're looking for reports, particularly in new areas of the state. And the ideal time to look for those is June through October, because that's usually when they're the most visible.